The Lord Yeshua knew who he was from the very beginning. So when he started his ministry, he was certain of his identity, that he was the Son of God, and he was aware of his mission and his message. Well, unlike other prophets, at one time in their lives, they received a message from the Lord, and then they discovered that God was calling them into prophetic ministry. But the Lord Yeshua did not go through that self-discovery. Since he was young, he knew who he was, his purpose, and his message. He was never confused about that. He was excellent in the scriptures. He lived a moral life, a perfect one. He was very spiritual, and he was simply amazing. Comparing him with the Prophet of Islam, it's not even close. Last week, we discussed how Yeshua attracted people to himself, so many of them. He was simply an amazing man. Now, you will notice that when he presented himself to the people, he did it in a progressive manner because people needed time to understand who he was. But unlike the next coming of the Lord, it will be very quick and surprising, and we obviously know who he is, okay? But here in the first Advent, though his baptism was full of impact, his approach to the people was progressive or gradual. One miracle at a time, and then he challenged people to think about who he really was. He taught in one town after another with power and authority. He gave the simplest people the opportunity to know and understand him. He invited them to follow him and learn from him. He was very approachable, gentle, and meek. As Yeshua continued to slowly show the people that he was the awaited Mashiach, we will turn to the Gospel of Yochanan to see his version on how he tried to convince the people to believe in him. We will be turning to the second chapter with two events to talk about. The first one in Galilee or Galilee. The second one is in Jerusalem. The title of our message for today is Provocative Signs of the Messiah. I will share a couple of points, one from each of the stories that we will be discussing tonight. So my challenge is, will you take note of the signs of Yeshua or not? Some people are interested with God, well, some are not. When Yeshua came, he challenged all people. And they had to respond because he was about to change everything. Up to now, when we proclaim the Lord Yeshua, the Spirit of the Cristo is challenging people. This is Yeshua, the Son of God. What will you do about him? Right? Letter A, sign of glorious future with the Mashiach. Now, you will notice in the Gospels, Yeshua keeps on going back and forth from the regions of Galilee and Yehuda. He also tried to reach out to Samaria, the region between Galilee and Yehuda, as well as Idumea at the south and Perea and Decapolis in the east, and in Syrophoenicia in the north. Now, let me start with verse 11, which is actually the last part of the story because this summarizes everything. Yeshua did this as the first of his miraculous signs in Cana of Galilee. In this way, he revealed his glory and his disciples believed in him. So actually throughout the whole book, you will find these two motifs, glory and belief. Now, Bible commentators outline the whole book of the Gospel of Yochanan into three major parts. The first part is the prologue, which is the first 18 verses of chapter 1. And then from chapter 1 verse 19 up to chapter 12 verse 50, the end of the chapter 12, this is the book of signs. There were 7 signs that were mentioned there. And then chapter 13 up to the end of the chapter, well, actually there's still the conclusion. This is the book of glory. So the signs lead to the glorious part of the Lord Yeshua. The reason why the Lord wanted to show his divine glory is to convince the people to believe him, especially his disciples, because he will be their witnesses. Well, in fact, the whole Gospel of Yochanan is testimony about Yeshua. So, Yochanan wrote this Gospel specifically to make people believe the Lord Yeshua, especially that they didn't get to see him. Okay? So, chapter 20, verse 31 summarizes the purpose. People who believe will receive life in his name. Now, let me talk a little bit about the glory because this is actually explained in the prologue in chapter 1, verse 31. Now, the Word became flesh and took up residence among us. We saw his glory, the glory of the one and only, full of grace and truth, who came from the Father. So, Yochanan is explaining to us that the glory that he saw, the witnesses saw about the Lord Yeshua was uniquely as that of the Son of God. You cannot find that kind of glory with any other. Okay? Because that glory is the same with the Father. So here in the first story in the Gospel of Yochanan, chapter 2, verses 1 to 12, Yochanan claimed that this was the first sign he showed about his glory. Let's proceed with the story in verse 1. Now on the third day, since they arrived there, There was a wedding at Cana in Galilee. Yeshua's mother was there, and Yeshua and his disciples were also invited to the wedding. So why Cana? Remember, this is the hometown of Nathanael. And remember also that the Lord Yeshua promised him in chapter 1 verse 50 that he will see much more glorious things with the miracles and the teachings that he will be witnessing from then on. So imagine how excited Nathanael was that the Lord Yeshua will be coming to his own hometown. He will be doing great things there. Now, it is possible that Yeshua and his team were invited in this wedding because Nathanael, maybe he's connected with them. It was an opportunity for the Lord Yeshua to reach out as many people as he could in these very special events, especially that there will be many prominent people attending there. Verse 3, when the wine ran out, Yeshua's mother said to him, "They have no wine left." Yeshua replied, "Woman, why are you saying this to me? My time has not yet come." His mother told the servants, "Whatever he tells you, do it." All right? People love special wine, especially during weddings. It's not just an ordinary wine. Now, looking at verse 3, why did Yeshua's mother want him to get involved into the problem? Well, it's just wine. It's their problem. It's not their problem, right? Maybe she thought that they can help out. They can solve because they knew that the Lord Yeshua can do miraculous things. Maybe she didn't want the wedding to be ruined. Wow, that was a very special occasion. Or maybe she saw an opportunity for Yeshua to grab the attention of a lot of people and actually proclaim himself as the Mashiach right there. But look at this, how the Lord responded in verse 4. It looks like he didn't like what his mom was doing. Not exactly. You will notice that throughout the gospel, Yeshua would occasionally withdraw from the people. So he didn't want too much attention. The gospel of Marco actually shows this. Too much attention might cause him trouble. It would be premature. That's why he responded here, "My time has not yet come." So I think he was telling her to tone down. That's what it means. Don't put too much attention on me here. He did not want any aggrandizement. He wanted to be low-key, not famous, though he cannot really avoid being famous in that place. So you can see from his mother's response, she understood what the Lord meant, probably just toned down. Whatever he tells you, do it. So that means the Lord agreed actually to do something about the situation. So his mother allowed him to do it his way, not in a mother's way. So, you know, stage moms. I think Mariam was kind of becoming a stage mom at that moment. But again, she understood that she should not get ahead of the Lord. Let the Lord do it his way. She should not preempt his moves and his ways. Understood? Verse 6. Now there were 6 stone water jars for ceremonial washing of the Yehudis, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Yeshua told the servants, "Fill the water jars with water." So they filled them up to the very top. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the head steward." And they did. We cannot miss that part, that the Lord Yeshua used those kinds of jars for ceremonial cleansing. The Lord Yeshua was sort of explaining to them that he is the one who cleanses them. Okay, so this is not to intoxicate them, but to show that he is the provider of water cleansing them. So ceremonial washing jars to show that there was something special that was about to take place. Now, the water container that we usually use right now, we can see that from the picture. I guess you have several of them in your homes. The capacity of each one of this is 5 gallons. Now, those ceremonial jars are huge, about 4 to 5 times larger than each of our water containers that we use nowadays. And the story says there that there are about 6 stone water jars. So if we can estimate the total number of water in all 6 jars, it would fill up about a bathtub. That's the huge amount of wine, water turned into wine. That's a lot of wine. I don't think people there would be able to consume it, but if they do, it's just a feast of wine there. Usually a bathtub will be about 500 liters. Were they alcoholic? We don't know. We don't know. Normally, wedding wines are alcoholic, but again, we don't know if this could intoxicate the people. They were not made from any fruit. I don't think that's the point anymore, but obviously, it was better than any wine that they have ever drunk. Okay? Let's continue with verse 9. When the head steward tasted the water that had been turned to wine, not knowing where it came from. Though the servants who had drawn the water knew, he called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the cheaper wine when the guests are drunk. You have kept the good wine until now." Sort of, this head steward was blaming the bridegroom, thinking that he had something to do about it. Well, the servants didn't say anything at all. Look at this. Yeshua took advantage of their problem with water to make a miracle about water and much better. Right? Though the head steward did not know that it was Yeshua who did the miracle, actually they were drinking wine that was a product of a miraculous work. It was only after the event that the people realized that a miracle actually took place. So eventually, we suppose that the people found out that Yeshua did this. But how can you have that much wine? It must be a miracle. How can you keep that? How can you keep that much wine? The point is, they were just so happy with the wine that they did not care anymore where it came from, right? But of course, the news spread out that the Lord Yeshua did so. So there were witnesses, his disciples, and of course, the servants who poured the water into the jars and took them, and wine came out of it. Verse 11, Yeshua did this as the first of his miraculous signs in Cana of Galilee. In this way, he revealed his glory through the miracle, and his disciples believed him. So that was just the first one. Well, some people will not believe with just one miraculous work, but his disciples did. Now, verse 11, Yochanan gets to the bottom line. We read this earlier as we were beginning to discuss letter A. This is about the glory of Yeshua. This is about his glory. The disciples were able to recognize that this was a glorious work of the Mashiach. Note that Yeshua had to gradually convince his disciples that he could do supernatural things. Because, again, it takes time for people to understand miraculous things. Okay? After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. So verse 12 is very simple. Yeshua and his whole team moved on because they had to do other things there in other places. Cana to Capernaum is about 37.4 kilometers far, going north, a little bit to the eastern side. Okay? Now, let me talk about first water in the Gospel of Yochanan, because you find this as one of the important motifs of the Gospel. In chapter 1, water was used in the ministry of Yochanan as a symbol of cleansing, as people who came there to him repented. In chapter 2, which is our story for today, he turned water into wine. Again, Yeshua is the source of water. Okay? Chapter 3, which we will be talking about next time, the Lord Yeshua told Nicodemo that unless a man be born of water and spirit. Okay? Again, the water motif is there. Chapter 4, we will discuss again at some other time. The Lord Yeshua went to Samaria and he evangelized a woman there. And he went to the well of Jacob and he used that illustration to show that he provides living water. We'll discuss more about that when you get there. Chapter 5, the Lord Yeshua healed a man who was waiting for an angel to come and to get healed. But the Lord Yeshua said, I can provide healing for you. So he used again the water there, the pool in Bethsaida in Jerusalem. Now in chapter 7, in Jerusalem during the Feast of Booths, actually the last day, which was the greatest day, Yeshua stood up and shouted, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me, and let the one who believes in me drink. Just as the scripture says, from within him will flow rivers of living water." We'll discuss this some other time. Again, water is used here. Chapter 13, the Lord poured water into the wash basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and dry them with the towel which he wrapped around himself. Again, it symbolizes cleansing. And then in verse 10, Yeshua replied to Petro, "The one who has bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you, disciples, are clean, but not every one of you." You know who that person is, all right? And then the last, in chapter 19, when Yeshua's side was pierced as he was hanging on the cross, they had to put him down. They had to make sure that he was dead. Verse 34, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and blood and water flowed out immediately. It has a spiritual meaning, a spiritual significance. In 1 Yochanan, I'm talking about the epistle, in chapter 5, verse 6, Yeshu Cristo is the one who came by water and blood. Not by water only, but by water and blood. Again, water symbolizes cleansing. Very important. Okay? Now, this actually reminds the people about how Yahweh used Moshe to provide them water. Remember when they traveled from Egypt and they crossed the Sea of Reeds. Now, let me jump to chapter 15, verse 22. They were able to cross by this time. Then Moshe led Israel to journey away from the Sea of Reeds. They went out of the desert of Shur, walked for 3 days into the desert and found no water. Right? Then they came to Marah, but they were not able to drink the waters of Marah because they were bitter. That is why its name was Marah. So, it's not drinkable. Just like in the story of the wedding in Cana, it's just water. Okay, they can drink it, but it's not really for that purpose. They were expecting wine. So the Lord made bitter water into potable water. In Cana, He made ordinary water into wine. Verse 24, so the people murmured against Moshe, saying, what can we drink? Verse 25, when he cried out to the Yahweh, Moshe, and the Yahweh showed him a tree. When Moshe threw it into the water became safe to drink. So, water is converted to something better. There, the Yahweh made for them a binding ordinance, and there He tested them. He said, if you will diligently obey the Yahweh your Elohim, and do what is right in His sight, and pay attention to His commands, and keep His statutes, then all the diseases that I brought on the Egyptians I will not bring on you, for I, the Yahweh, am your healer. Then they came to Elimah, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped there by the water. So water is very important for life. You know, water is essential to life. It quenches thirst. Now, if you're one of them, you would also cry out for water. Dehydration can make one weak. Hydration can make one stronger again, right? You know, our bodies is made up of about 60% water, right? So Moshe, by God's power, turned bitter water to potable water. Now look at this. There's this weird thing here. A tree made the water potable or drinkable. Now, this is actually prophetic of the crucifixion of the Lord Yeshua. Okay? And also, when we turn to the book of Revelation, chapter 22, in Jerusalem, verse 1, then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, water as clear as crystal, pouring out from the throne of God and of the Lamb, flowing down the middle of the city's main street. On each side of the river is the tree of life. So you see there, water and tree. Both refers to life. Water of life, tree of life. Producing 12 kinds of fruits, yielding its fruit every month of the year. Its leaves are for the healing of the nations. We will live forever because Yeshua is the source of life. So He's using the tree and the water as a way of providing us life. Right? We will have an eternal supply of life-giving water coming from the tree of life. Isn't that amazing? Now, it's not just about water. Why did the Lord Yeshua use this event, this wedding? Revelation, okay, Apocalypse also talked about a wedding. In chapter 19, verse 7, let us rejoice and exult and give Him glory, because the wedding celebration of the Lamb has come, and His bride has made herself ready. Then the angel said to me, write the following, blessed are those who are invited to the banquet at the wedding celebration of the Lamb. So this is what we can look forward to. So it's not just about the wedding in Cana. We can also imagine that we will be a part of the wedding when Yeshua takes us, all His people. Isn't that amazing? So that's the first point. Letter A, sign of glorious future with the Mashiach. Yeshua is the source of living water. Letter B, the sign of the Mashiach's divine authority. Now, if Yeshua is the Mashiach, He had divine authority, right? So the story we'll be discussing today is parallel to Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 to 17, Marco chapter 11, verses 15 to 19, and Luke chapter 19, verses 45 to 48. Well, actually, the place of this story in the Gospel of Yochanan, compared to the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Marco, and Luca, Yochanan places it at the beginning of Yeshua's ministry, while the Synoptic Gospels place it at the last week of Yeshua's ministry. Now, was this the same ministry? It's just that Yochanan placed it in the beginning for a certain purpose. Many scholars think so, that this is just the same event. Or did he do it a couple of times? I have no problems with either interpretation if Yeshua did it a couple of times. Okay? So, let's continue by reading verse 13. Now, the Pashka or Peshach of the Yehudis was near. So, on April, the second week of April, we will have the Peshach again. the commemoration, of course. We call it Holy Week for us Christians. So Yeshua went up to Jerusalem. He found in the temple courts those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers sitting at the tables. So he made a whip of cords and drove them all out of the temple courts with the sheep and the oxen. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. Now, you can see that the Lord Yeshua was very mad at what he saw in the temple courts. Now, this is a major gathering of the Yehudis, one of the three major events that every male Yehudi had to go to celebrate and observe the three major feasts. Actually, there are 7 of them, but some of them are grouped together. Now, men outside of Israel or Yehuda had to take this pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So you can imagine they were excited to visit Jerusalem at this special occasion, but when they found out that there's so many people there, they wanted to go near the temple, but there were people taking their place because of these money changers, okay? Because they had to offer sacrifices and they had taken advantage of the space to do some business, all right? So you can see in verse 14 that the Lord Yeshua was disappointed at the chaos and the encroachment. They shouldn't be doing that, those business within the temple courts. They should do it outside. Now, look at what he did in verse 15. He made the whip of cords. Now, why? You know, whip is for punishment, to inflict pain. He's saying that he's a judge and a punisher. He can force the illegal vendors and businessmen to leave the temple courts. It's like MMDA clearing operation. Do you watch that in YouTube? Now, this is actually in fulfillment of Yeshayahu chapter 10 or Isaiah chapter 10, verse 26. The Yahweh who commands armies is about to beat them with a whip, similar to the way he struck down Midian at the rock of Oreb. He will use his staff against the sea, lifting it up as he did in Egypt. So Yeshua was showing that the whip is instrument of his divine authority to punish them. Okay, verse 16. To those who sold the doves, he said, "Take these things away from here. Do not make my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will devour me." So that's a quote from Psalm 69 verse 9. Now, Yeshua did not fail to explain why he did that. He had to address it to the people, especially the business people that he was driving away. Well, actually, they knew that they were doing business in the wrong place. It's prohibited to do business there. Now, take note of that. Yeshua called the temple my Father's house. Okay? He personalized it. He didn't say our house or our God's house. He said my Father's house because he had a unique relationship with the Father. We'll learn more about that some other time. Now, when you look at the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Marco, and Luca, they did not use Psalm 69 verse 9. It was unique to Yochanan. Instead, they used Yeshayahu chapter 56 verse 7. When we look there, this is what Yeshua said, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you are turning it into a den of robbers." So I think Yohanan is distinguishing really his narration of this story by putting it at the beginning of his ministry and giving it a different basis. Instead of Yeshayahu, he based it on Psalm 69 verse 9. Also in Marco chapter 11 verse 17, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations," because the temple courts, the Gentiles were allowed to get near, at least to that part. "But you have turned it into a den of robbers." Also in Luke chapter 19 verse 46, Yeshua said to them, "It is written, my house will be a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of robbers." Again, the context there is this was Yeshua's final week in Jerusalem before he got crucified. Okay? So I think it was intentional for Yochanan not to quote Yeshayahu chapter 56 verse 7, instead quoted Psalm 69 verse 9. Let's continue verse 18. "So then the Yehudis responded, 'What signs can you show us since you are doing these things?' Yeshua replied, 'Destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up again.'" So the people understood that Yeshua's action and declaration that this was my Father's house was a sign of his divine authority. So that's why they asked the Lord to prove it further by doing something supernatural, because they expect every prophet to be able to do supernatural things. They were making it hard for the Lord, thinking that he would not be able to give them a sign. And so they thought. But Yeshua said, verse 19, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again." He didn't say, "I'm going to give you a sign right now. You watch out for the sign. You will see it. You will see it." So, in the Gospel of Matthew and Marco, when Yeshua was on trial before the Sanhedrin, before he was brought to the Romans. And when he was hanging on the cross, okay, people were witnessing against him. And they were mocking him for claiming that he could destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. But you will not see that claim of Yeshua anywhere in the gospel. You can only find that verbatim from the Lord here in Yohanan, chapter 2, verse 19. Destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise up again. So they were aware that Yeshua said this. Yeshua said this. Okay? However, Matthew and Marco did not say when Yeshua said it. Okay? Let's continue, verse 20. Then the Yehudis said to him, this temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you are going to raise it up in 3 days? You're crazy. But Yeshua was speaking about the temple of his body. So after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the saying that Yeshua had spoken. All right. So Jewish historian Josephus claimed that the reconstruction of the temple initiated by Herod the Great started in 19 BC. So even before Yeshua was born. This was the same Herod that tried to kill babies, trying to find Yeshua in that instance. We know that there is a discrepancy in the Gregorian calendar about 3 to 5 years. So anyway, if 46 years is accurate here in verse 20, then the Passover would have been about AD 27 or 28. Now, look at that verse 21. Yeshua shifted from the physical to the spiritual, which he does many times in the Gospel of Yohanan. So, the Gospel writer, Yohanan, explained why Yeshua shifted from the physical temple to his body as the real temple of God. That's why we Christians, we don't wait for another temple. The Jews wanted a new temple, okay, a third temple. But for us, we don't need that because Yeshua is the temple of God. Throughout the Gospel of Yohanan, he kept on showing how Yeshua would use physical references to spiritual realities, which confused so many of his listeners. It was intentional for Yeshua, so somehow to confuse them, to explain them that they have always earthly perspective, that they had to learn to understand things with spiritual perspectives because he was a spiritual teacher. All right? Now, verse 22 is very important. Yohanan explains that Yeshua's followers only realized this after his resurrection. He said that his disciples remembered that he had said this. Okay, that's when they put things together. Okay, so the resurrection proved everything Yeshua said to be true. So this led to belief. So even though they believed him in the beginning, but their belief was sealed when they saw the Lord rise from the dead. Okay, and they had to relate it with scriptures because the scriptures have been testifying, referring to the Old Testament. They believed the scripture, Old Testament prophecies, and that Yeshua was the one who fulfilled it. All right? Verse 23. Now, while Yeshua was in Jerusalem at the feast of the Pascha, many people believed in his name because they saw the miraculous signs he was doing. But Yeshua would not entrust himself to people because he knew all people. He did not need anyone to testify about man, for he knew what was in man. Now, again, in verse 23, Yohanan had to give an explanation to the people. Now, Yohanan is telling us good news, that the Lord Yeshua did many other things, okay, but he did not count that as one of the signs. Okay, when you count the signs in the book of signs, there's 7 of them. This cleansing of the temple is not one of the signs. Okay, it's not counted. But obviously, he did a lot of signs. Okay, they saw the miraculous signs he was doing. He did miracles, many other things in Jerusalem. And many believed him. Miracles help people believe. And later on, we will discover that people believe because of miracles, which is also true even nowadays. People would believe if they see something supernatural. But the purpose of this gospel, he will say, even though you haven't seen him, you believe him. All right? Now, Yeshua had to be very careful because not everybody who believed him actually believed him or were faithful to him. That's the point. Okay? You will see in other parts of Yohanan, he said they were so afraid of coming out. He had so many secret followers. It's because they were afraid of being kicked out of the synagogues because they loved the praises of men rather than the praise of God. Anyway, when we get there, we'll discuss more about that. But here, you will find in verse 24 and 25, very important, in the whole book of Yohanan, Yeshua knew people whom he encountered. Okay, so remember these 2 verses as we go along with our other studies. Yeshua knew people. Yeshua knew people. Yeshua had the supernatural knowledge about people's internals, the heart and the mind. Okay? The heart and the mind. He really knew who really believed him, who were hesitant, and who truly were faithful to him. Okay? Especially the one who betrayed him. Okay? Actually, chapter 6, verse 64, another story when he fed about 5,000 people. He said, but there are some of you who do not believe, for Yeshua had already known from the beginning who those were who did not believe and who it was who would betray him. He knew people. He knew people. He knew you and I. We cannot escape him. We cannot hide what is inside of our hearts. The Lord Yeshua knows us quite so well, whether we actually believe him or not. Okay? Now, let me give you another reference in chapter 16, verse 30. This is the end of chapter 16 before Yeshua prayed in chapter 17. Yeshua's disciples said, now we know that you know everything and do not need anyone to ask you anything. Because of this, we believe that you have come from God, because only God can know these things. But you know all things. And therefore, we believe that you came from God. Okay? This is supernatural. And any rabbi or teacher would not know what is inside people's heart. But Yeshua did. So he had to be a unique teacher. He had to be coming from God. Even his betrayer, he knew from the very beginning. So that's letter B, the sign of the Mashiach's divine authority. The religious leaders could not stop Yeshua from cleansing the temple. They knew he was actually correct in doing that. They knew he was a great rabbi and people believed him, so they could not stop him. After all, the miraculous signs that Yeshua showed them, performed them, the problem is they still refuse to believe him. Referring to the religious leaders. Have you heard of these three elements of faith? Knowledge, assent, and trust. It's one thing to simply know for a fact. It's another to believe that fact. It's another to trust in that. So, may we not only believe that Yeshua is the Son of God, may we not just agree, but may we entrust ourselves to Yeshua, the Mashiach. Alright? So, provocative signs of the Mashiach. He turned water into wine in Cana, and he cleansed the temple in Jerusalem. The sign of glorious future with the Mashiach, when he turned water into wine in Cana, and then the sign of the Mashiach's divine authority when he cleansed the temple. Do you believe in the Mashiach?